Emily stood in the middle of the funeral home, her heart feeling heavier than ever before. The room was silent except for the quiet sobs of family members and the occasional whispers of visitors. The air smelled of fresh flowers, their sweet scent mixing with the sorrow that filled the space. But Emily hardly noticed any of it. Her eyes were locked on the wooden coffin in front of her. It was open, revealing the still body of her father, Mark. She had always seen her father as the strongest man in the world. He was the one who carried her on his shoulders when she was little, the one who tucked her into bed every night, the one who made her laugh even on the worst days. And now he was lying there, not moving, not breathing. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. Emily's mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want to say your final goodbye, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the coffin. As she stood over him, she studied his face. He looked peaceful, almost as if he were just sleeping. But she knew he wasn't going to wake up this time. Tears filled her eyes, and before she could stop herself, she whispered, "Daddy, please come back." The weight of her sorrow became too much. Without thinking, Emily climbed into the coffin and wrapped her arms around him. Her small hands gripped his suit, holding onto him as if her love alone could bring him back. She rested her head against his chest, her body shaking with silent cries. The room around her seemed to fade away. She didn't care if people were watching, whispering, or if they thought she was acting strangely. She just wanted to be close to him one last time. Her mother gasped softly but didn't pull her away. The other mourners watched in silence, their own tears falling as they witnessed the heartbreaking scene. A few people turned away, unable to bear the sight of a young girl holding onto her father's lifeless body. But Emily didn't let go. She closed her eyes, listening for something, anything. She wanted to feel his heartbeat, to hear his voice telling her everything was okay. But there was nothing. The room felt colder. Her hands trembled as she gripped him tighter. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "I don't want to say goodbye." The moment stretched on, and just as someone finally stepped forward to gently lift her away, something unbelievable happened. A faint sound, a small movement, a breath. Emily's eyes widened. Had she imagined it? Then it happened again, a slight rise and fall of his chest, a soft, weak sound escaping his lips. Gasps filled the room. People froze, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Emily didn't move. She could feel it. Something had changed. And in that moment, hope returned. For a long moment, the room remained completely silent. No one moved. No one even breathed. Everyone had seen it. Something impossible had just happened. The man who was supposed to be gone forever had made a sound. A soft gasp, barely noticeable, but it was real. Emily didn't blink. She was still holding onto her father, her tiny fingers gripping his suit tightly. Had she imagined it? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her because she wanted so badly for him to come back? But then it happened again. A slow, weak movement in his chest. A tiny breath escaping his lips. This time, the silence in the room shattered. A woman let out a shocked cry. Someone else whispered in disbelief. Emily's mother took a step closer, her hands covering her mouth, her whole body shaking. The funeral director, who had been standing quietly in the corner, rushed forward, his face pale. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "No, it's not possible," another voice answered. Emily didn't care what anyone else was saying. She pressed her ear against her father's chest, desperately hoping, praying, that she would hear something. And then, like the softest drumbeat, she heard it. A heartbeat, faint, slow, but there. There. Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't just from sadness. They were from something else. Hope. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing. Then her father's fingers twitched slightly. A weak groan escaped his lips. Emily gasped, sitting up quickly. "He's alive," she shouted. He's alive. The room erupted into chaos. Some people backed away, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others rushed forward, trying to understand what was happening. The funeral director grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed for an ambulance. Emily's mother dropped to her knees beside the coffin, reaching out to touch her husband's face. "Mark," she choked out. "Can you hear me?" Mark's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't fully wake up. His breathing was shallow, his body still, but there was no doubt about it. He was alive. The paramedics arrived within minutes, pushing through the crowd of stunned mourners. They quickly examined Mark, checking his pulse, his breathing. Their faces were filled with shock, but they didn't waste time asking questions. They carefully lifted him from the coffin, placing him on a stretcher. Emily refused to let go of his hand. Even as they wheeled him toward the ambulance, she stayed by his side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked one of the paramedics, her voice small and full of fear. "We don't know yet," the paramedic admitted. "But this is a miracle." Emily squeezed her father's hand tighter. Deep in her heart, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't letting him go. Not now. Not ever. The ambulance raced through the streets, sirens blaring. Inside, Emily sat beside her father, holding his hand tightly. Her heart pounded so fast she thought it might burst. She kept her eyes locked on his face, watching for any sign that he might wake up. His breathing was still shallow, and his skin was pale, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Her mother sat across from her, gripping the edge of the seat, her face filled with worry and hope. The paramedics worked quickly, checking Mark's pulse, his oxygen levels, and his heart rate. They'd whispered to each other, their expressions serious. "This shouldn't be possible," one of them muttered. "He was declared dead. How is he?" "We don't know," the other interrupted, "but we need to keep him stable." Emily's mother reached over and took her daughter's free hand. "He's fighting," she whispered, "just like he always does." Emily nodded, but she was too scared to speak. She just wanted to hear his voice again. She wanted to see him open his eyes and smile at her like he used to. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses were already waiting. They'd rushed Mark inside, moving so fast that Emily and her mother had to run to keep up. The bright hospital lights made everything feel more real. This wasn't a dream. It was really happening. A nurse gently stopped them at the emergency room doors. "We need to take him in for tests," she said. "Please wait here." Emily didn't want to let go of her father's hand, but her mother pulled her close. "Let them help him," she said softly. Hours passed. Every second felt like an eternity. Emily sat in the waiting area, staring at the floor, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. People came and went. Doctors rushed by. Machines beeped in the distance, but none of it mattered. The only thing she cared about was the man lying in that hospital bed. Finally, a doctor walked toward them. His face was serious, but there was something in his eyes, something that gave Emily hope. "How is he?" her mother asked quickly. The doctor took a deep breath. "Your husband is alive," he said. "His heart is beating on its own. He's weak, but he's stable for now." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at her mother, seeing tears in her eyes. "Can we see him?" her mother asked. The doctor nodded, just for a moment. "He's not fully conscious yet, but he's responding." Emily jumped up before he could finish his sentence. She grabbed her mother's hand, and together, they followed the doctor through the long hallway. When they reached the hospital room, Emily's heart stopped. There he was, her father, alive, lying in the hospital bed, breathing. And then something amazing happened. His fingers twitched. Then, slowly, his eyes began to open. Emily held her breath as she watched her father's eyes slowly flutter open. For a moment, they were unfocused, as if he was lost in a dream. Then, they moved, scanning the room, searching. "Daddy," Emily whispered, stepping closer to his bedside. Mark's lips parted slightly, and a weak sound escaped, too soft to understand. But it was enough. He was here. He was alive. Emily's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears rolled down her face as she clutched Emily's shoulder. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, steady but slow. The machines attached to him hummed softly, keeping track of his vitals. A nurse quickly checked his pulse, while a doctor leaned in, watching closely. "Mark," the doctor said gently, "can you hear me?" Mark's fingers twitched again. Then, slowly, his eyes moved toward the sound of the doctor's voice. He blinked a few times, his breathing shallow but steady. Emily's heart pounded. She squeezed his hand, hoping, praying, that he would respond. And then, in the faintest whisper, he spoke. "Emily." It was barely a sound, but it sent a wave of relief and joy through her entire body. She nodded quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm here, Daddy. I'm right here." Mark's lips curved slightly, the smallest hint of a smile. He looked tired, weak, but there was something in his eyes. Recognition. He knew her. He was coming back. The doctor turned to Emily's mother. "This is incredible," he said. "We still don't fully understand what happened, but his body is responding well. He needs rest, but he's stable." Emily's mother nodded, wiping her tears away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The nurse adjusted Mark's pillow, checking the IV attached to his arm. "We'll keep a close watch on him," she said kindly. "You should let him rest for now." Emily didn't want to leave, but she knew they were right. Her father had come back to her, and now he needed time to heal. She gently squeezed his hand one more time. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. Mark's fingers moved slightly, returning the squeeze, even in his weak state. It was the smallest gesture, but to Emily it meant everything. As they left the room, her mother wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "He's going to be okay," she whispered. Emily nodded. For the first time in days, she truly believed it. Her father had been gone, really gone. But somehow, against all odds, he had come back. And she knew deep in her heart, this was only the beginning. The next few days at the hospital felt like a dream. Emily and her mother stayed by Mark's side, watching over him as he slowly regained his strength. Nurses came in and out, checking his vitals, adjusting his IV, and making sure he was comfortable. Doctors ran tests, trying to understand how something like this could happen. Mark was still weak, speaking only in soft whispers, but every time he opened his eyes and looked at Emily, she felt warmth in her heart. He was really here. She hadn't lost him. One afternoon, as Emily sat beside his bed, holding his hand, her father suddenly spoke. His voice was hoarse, but clear enough to make her heart race. I heard you." Emily blinked in surprise. "What?" she asked, leaning closer. Mark's tired eyes met hers. "When I was gone," he said slowly, as if searching for the right words, "I heard you crying. I felt you holding me." Emily's eyes widened. She had no idea what to say. How could he have felt anything? He had been lying in the coffin, not breathing, not moving. He had been. She couldn't even say the word. Her mother sat up straighter. "You remember something?" she asked gently. Mark nodded slightly. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was like I was floating. In darkness. It felt peaceful, but distant, like I was far away from everything." Emily's heart pounded. She squeezed his hand tighter. "Then what happened?" she asked. Mark took a slow breath. "I heard your voice," he said. "I felt warmth. I felt your arms around me. And suddenly, I wasn't floating anymore. I was coming back." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "You came back because of me." Mark gave a small, weak smile. "I think so." Her mother wiped her eyes, overwhelmed with emotion. "Mark, the doctor said this shouldn't be possible. They said your heart stopped for too long, but somehow you're here." Just then, the doctor walked in, holding a clipboard. He looked both amazed and curious. "Mark," he said, "we've reviewed all your tests. Medically speaking, what happened to you is extremely rare. We believe you may have experienced something called Lazarus syndrome, a condition where, after failed resuscitation, the heart starts beating again on its own." Emily exchanged a look with her mother. The words sounded scientific, but they didn't explain everything. The doctor continued, "This condition is so rare that most doctors only read about it in textbooks. But even with that, your case is unique. You weren't just gone for minutes, you were prepared for burial. And yet here you are." Mark listened quietly, then turned to Emily. His fingers, still weak, gently squeezed hers. "I don't know about medical terms," he said softly, "but I know one thing for sure." "What's that?" Emily asked. Mark smiled. "Love brought me back." Emily let out a small laugh through her tears. She believed it too, because in that moment, it didn't matter what science said. All that mattered was that her father was here, and she wasn't letting him go. Mark's recovery was slow, but every small improvement felt like a miracle. Each day, he regained a little more strength. He could sit up longer, speak more clearly, and even eat small meals. The doctors were amazed, but no one was more grateful than Emily and her mother. Emily spent every moment she could by his side. She told him stories about what had happened in the days he had been gone, about how she had refused to believe he was really gone. Her voice was full of love and excitement, and Mark listened carefully, a warm smile on his face. One afternoon, as she sat next to him, he suddenly reached out and took her hand. "Emily," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, curious. "What is it, Daddy?" Mark took a deep breath. "When I was on the other side, I wasn't afraid," he said. "I felt peaceful. But then I heard you crying, and something inside me told me I couldn't leave." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You came back for me." Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, I don't remember everything, but I know this. I felt your love, and it pulled me back. I couldn't leave my little girl." Emily wiped her tears and smiled. "I knew you wouldn't leave me," she said proudly. Her mother, who had been listening quietly, placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "We're just happy you're here," she said. "It doesn't matter how or why. It's a blessing." The doctor came in a few minutes later, checking Mark's progress. "Your strength is improving," he said with a smile. "If this continues, you might be able to go home soon." Emily's face lit up. "Really?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, but he still needs rest. His body has been through something extraordinary." Emily turned to her father. "You hear that, Daddy? You're coming home." Mark smiled, squeezing her hand. "Home sounds perfect," he said. That night, as Emily and her mother sat beside him, Mark drifted off to sleep. His breathing was steady, his heartbeat strong. Emily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I still can't believe this happened," she whispered. Her mother kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes things happen that we can't explain," she said. "But all we can do is be thankful." Emily looked at her father, peaceful in his sleep. A few days ago, she had thought she had lost him forever. But now he was here, breathing, living. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't know who she was thanking. The universe, fate, or something greater, but she didn't need to understand it. All that mattered was that her father had come back. And this time, she knew he wasn't going anywhere. A few days later, the hospital room was filled with excitement. Mark had finally regained enough strength to sit up on his own, and the doctors had confirmed that he could go home. It was a moment that felt almost unreal. Just a short while ago, they had been preparing for his funeral, and now they were preparing to bring him back home. Emily watched as a nurse helped her father into a wheelchair. He was still weak, but there was color in his face again, and his eyes were full of life. He smiled at her, and she ran up to hug him. "You're really coming home, Daddy," she said, squeezing him tightly. Mark chuckled softly, wrapping his arms around her. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." Emily's mother signed the last of the hospital paperwork, thanking the doctors and nurses for everything they had done. The staff looked both happy and amazed. They had seen many patients recover, but nothing like this. "This is a story we'll never forget," one of the doctors said. "Your case is truly incredible." Mark smiled. "I think I had a little help," he said, looking at Emily. She beamed proudly. The drive home was quiet, but peaceful. Emily sat close to her father, watching him rest against the seat. She still couldn't believe this was happening. It felt like waking up from a bad dream and realizing everything was okay again. When they finally reached home, Emily ran ahead, opening the door wide. "Welcome back, Daddy," she cheered. Mark laughed as he slowly stepped inside with the help of his wife. He looked around the house, taking in the familiar sights: the couch where he used to sit and read, the dining table where they had shared so many meals, and the pictures on the walls that told their family story. "I missed this place," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Emily ran to the couch and patted the seat beside her. "Come sit, Daddy. You need to rest." Mark smiled and slowly made his way over. As soon as he sat down, Emily curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Her mother brought him a warm cup of tea and sat across from them, watching with teary eyes. "We almost lost you," she whispered. Mark reached out and took her hand. "But I came back," he said gently. "And I'm not going anywhere." Emily smiled. She knew in her heart that this was true. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was filled with laughter and warmth again. They sat together, talked, and simply enjoyed the gift of having each other. Emily held onto her father's hand tightly, as if making sure he wouldn't disappear. She had been given a second chance, and she was never going to take it for granted. As the night grew late, Mark looked down at his daughter and whispered, "Thank you for bringing me back, my little angel." And Emily knew this was the happiest moment of her life. The days passed, and Mark's strength slowly returned. Every morning, he would wake up to the sound of Emily's cheerful voice, excited to spend another day with her father. It was as if life had given them a second chance, and they were making the most of it. Emily never left his side. She helped him walk around the house, made sure he ate properly, and even read stories to him when he felt tired. Mark would smile and listen, knowing that each moment with his daughter was a gift. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Emily looked up at her father with curious eyes. "Daddy, do you ever think about what happened? About how you came back?" Mark took a deep breath, thinking for a moment. "Yes," he said softly. "I think about it all the time." Emily leaned closer. "Do you remember anything else?" Mark smiled gently. "I don't remember everything," he admitted. "But I do remember the feeling of love. It was like a light in the darkness, guiding me back. And I know that light was you." Emily's eyes filled with warmth. "I knew you wouldn't leave me," she whispered. Mark hugged her tightly. "Never," he promised. Their mother, who had been listening quietly, wiped away a tear and joined them on the couch. "This whole experience has taught us something important," she said. Emily tilted her head. "What's that, Mommy?" She smiled. "That love is the strongest force in the world. Stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. It has the power to bring people back, to heal wounds, and to give hope." Mark nodded in agreement. "And it has given me a second chance," he said. "A chance to love my family even more, to live with a heart full of gratitude." That evening, they sat together at the dinner table, something they hadn't done in a long time. The warmth of home surrounded them, and laughter filled the air. It was simple, yet beautiful. Just being together was enough. As Emily watched her father eat, laugh, and talk, she silently made a promise to herself. She would never take a single moment for granted. Every hug, every smile, every shared meal, they were all precious. After dinner, Mark sat outside on the porch, looking up at the night sky. Emily joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "The stars are beautiful tonight," she said. Mark smiled. "Yes, they are." He paused, then added, "You know, before all this happened, I was always so busy with work and responsibilities. But now, I see things differently. Life isn't about rushing. It's about enjoying the little moments." Emily held his hand. "I'm just happy you're here, Daddy." Mark kissed the top of her head. "And I'm happy I got to come back." Under the twinkling stars, with love surrounding them, they knew one thing for certain. Life was a gift, and they would cherish every single moment together.